North Africa, March 1943. The sand still smelled of burnt rubber and cordite after the clash at Kasserine Pass. A German engineering officer named Hauptmann Ernst Keller knelt beside a half-buried American Jeep. The tires were shredded, the windshield melted, but the gun still stood upright. The M2 Browning, its barrel streaked with mud and sand. Keller wiped his gloved hand across the receiver, pulled the charging handle, and the mechanism slid back smooth as glass. No grinding, no jam. He muttered in disbelief, "Keen wonder." And yet it won. No miracle. And yet it had triumphed. His assistant, Oberleutnant Vogt, tried to dismantle it. There were no fragile springs hidden deep inside, no eccentric levers demanding precision tools. It was all mass and proportion, pins and bolts. Keller lifted the heavy gun and laughed bitterly. "No genius," he said, "just a hammer that never stops." The men around him exchanged uneasy glances. They had been raised on the creed of mechanical purity, where complexity was a badge of civilization. Yet this crude, square-edged weapon had mowed through their finest designs. The MG-34s that jammed in sand, the trucks that overheated under desert dust, the cooling jackets that demanded silk gauze filters. By dusk, American prisoners were led past them under guard. One wounded corporal, his face streaked with grime, looked at Keller and said in a tired, almost kind voice, "That gun saved me more than once. You can curse it later." Keller didn't answer. He turned the gun over and saw the serial plate stamped, Colt Manufacturing Co., Hartford, Connecticut. A place he had only seen on maps, yet here it was, beating him through simplicity. In the war diary found later in Keller's camp locker, a line appeared. "Our mastery of form blinded us to the power of function. We built precision. They built persistence." It wasn't just a note of defeat. It was a confession. The engineers took the M2 apart on a wooden crate that night. Under the flickering lantern, they counted fewer than 200 moving pieces, half that of an MG-42. Every pin seemed forged by someone who trusted machines more than craftsmen. And the idea struck Keller like a wound. In America, a factory worker with a wrench had the same power as an officer with a diploma. The gun was democracy cast in steel. He could not sleep. Outside, the desert wind howled against the tents, flapping like wings of something ancient. He saw the faces of his own engineers, the pride of Stuttgart and Munich, designing with rulers and pride, creating beauty that broke under mud. He imagined them sneering at this ugly, square contraption and losing wars because of it. The M2 fired from 1933 to this very battlefield without a redesign. It weighed nearly 38 kilograms with its tripod, could spit 600 rounds per minute, and survive in every climate from snow to sandstorm. To the Germans, it was a primitive beast. But on that night, Keller began to understand. The beast survives because it never pretends to be divine. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. Where are you watching from? Tell us your location and local time below. I'd like to know where this story reaches tonight. In the distance, someone fired a single burst from a Browning left behind. The sound echoed through the empty wadi, the slow, rhythmic hammering of a civilization that never stopped building while others kept perfecting. The gun that mocked genius had spoken, and in its noise was prophecy. Weeks later, the captured engineers found themselves far from the desert's heat. The train windows frosted over as they crossed the Midwest under guard, bound for Camp Gruber, Oklahoma. Inside their compartment, Hauptmann Keller clutched a small bundle, the field sketches of the M2 Browning, drawn in pencil on American ration paper. His hands still smelled faintly of oil and cordite. The guard, a young sergeant from Nebraska, offered him a cup of coffee. "You'll like it here," the American said. "We've got workshops, and the tools work." Keller only nodded. When they arrived, the air smelled of wheat and machine grease. Rows of barracks stretched under a sky too wide for Europe. In the camp's technical section, Keller and Vogt were given access to the M2's disassembled parts for documentation. The first thing they noticed, the blueprint binder, only 20 pages thick. No ornamental curves, no unnecessary annotations, no philosopher's obsession with symmetry. Every line was straight, every note short. It looked like a manual written for the common man. They compared it to the MG-42's engineering volume they'd once guarded like scripture. 98 pages, curves like art, tolerance notes measured in fractions of a hair. "This isn't engineering," Vogt whispered. "This is philosophy." Keller corrected him softly. "No, it's humility." That night, snow began to fall outside the barracks. The wind hissed through the wooden slats, and from the mess hall came the sound of American guards laughing over a radio broadcast. Keller looked around at his fellow prisoners hunched over sketches of carbines, jeeps, even tin cans stamped with factory codes. What shocked him wasn't their captors' superiority. It was their lack of secrecy. America seemed unafraid of imitation, as though abundance itself was its armor. Inside the camp workshop, they tested tolerances with calipers. Each bolt and latch from different M2 models fit perfectly, as though made by one invisible hand. The Germans' obsession with custom machining, once their pride, now felt like a curse. In his notebook, Keller wrote, "They design for the farmer, not for the craftsman. Their genius lies in letting go." Vogt added below it, "We design for admiration. They design for use." During evening roll call, a captured Luftwaffe mechanic joked bitterly, "They build like they fight, together." No one laughed. The silence was heavier than the Oklahoma cold. When the engineers were allowed into the camp's small library, Keller found a copy of Popular Mechanics. On the cover, an illustration of a smiling worker building an airplane engine. No generals, no grand emblems, just a man and his wrench. He studied it for minutes, then folded the cover into his diary. "Their machines are built by people who believe they matter," he murmured. Outside, snow covered the barbed wire like lace. Beyond it, America pulsed with factories, railroads, and the hum of freedom mistaken for noise. In a quiet moment before lights out, Keller whispered to Vogt, "Maybe we lost before the first shot." Vogt asked, "Because of their weapons?" Keller shook his head. "Because they build as if everyone is trusted to hold the wrench." The lamp flickered and died, leaving the barracks in darkness. On Keller's desk lay two blueprints, one of elegance, one of simplicity. The difference between them wasn't just design, it was destiny drawn in ink. Outside, the wind turned the pages, as if history itself were choosing which plan to keep. The winter sun hung pale over the plains when an American ordnance officer named Captain James Holler arrived at Camp Gruber with a demonstration unit. The prisoners were ordered to the firing range, not as soldiers but as witnesses. In front of them stood a tripod-mounted M2 Browning, its barrel dark with use. Holler, broad-shouldered and calm, greeted them through a translator. "Every gun we send to the front can have its barrel replaced by the man firing it," he said. "No need for permission, no need for rank." A murmur spread among the German engineers. In the Wehrmacht, only licensed armorers were authorized to touch the cooling sleeve of a heavy weapon. To disassemble a machine gun without approval could earn a court-martial. Here, a private could strip and rebuild a weapon as easily as changing a tire. Vogt whispered, half in awe, "They trust their soldiers more than we trust our officers." Holler demonstrated, loosening the barrel with practiced ease. He spoke while working. "This one," he said, patting the metal, "was designed for the mud of France and the heat of Africa. We don't expect her to be delicate. We expect her to work." He replaced the barrel, fired a short burst, then handed the gun over to Keller. "Your turn, Captain." Keller hesitated. For the first time, an American officer was inviting him, a prisoner, to touch the symbol of his own defeat. The guards nodded. He gripped the handles, aimed at the target drums, and pressed the trigger. The roar startled even the guards. Shell casings leapt into the snow like brass rain. The weapon didn't flinch, didn't jam, didn't protest the untrained hands that guided it. Later in the workshop, Keller studied the recoil system, tracing his finger along the buffer assembly. "Democracy," he murmured, "is built into the steel. The trust moves backward and forward, like this spring. Each man is part of the return." Vogt frowned. "You speak as if a machine can vote." Keller replied, "Maybe it already has." That evening, they shared supper with their guards, beans, cornbread, and thick coffee. Holler joined them, wiping oil from his hands. "You know," he said with a grin, "Mr. Browning built this gun so a ranch hand could fix it under fire. No manuals, no arrogance." Keller smiled faintly. In our country, a ranch hand wouldn't be allowed near a machine gun. Haller laughed. Then you'd have lost faster. In his diary, Keller wrote that night, "They arm trust, we arm fear. That is why their bullets return home, and ours are lost." He recalled something from 1939 before the war. In a Stuttgart factory, his supervisor had berated a machinist for improvising a faster assembly jig. The man was demoted. Here in America, that same worker might have been promoted. By now, Keller began to sense that the Browning wasn't a miracle of engineering. It was the physical proof of a nation's soul. It was built by citizens, not subjects. It worked because they believed it should. Outside the barracks, a lone coyote howled under the moon. The sound reminded Keller of Europe, the echo of orders, of obedience, of men who followed too well. He wondered what it would feel like to live in a world where even a gun could be trusted to the common man. The range was quiet again, but the phrase, replaceable barrel, lingered in his mind like an idea too dangerous to say aloud. In America, even machines had the right to adapt. By early spring, the snow had melted from the Oklahoma plains. Camp Gruber's engineers set up a controlled test of the captured Browning under supervision. The air smelled of burnt oil and damp earth. Rows of ammunition belts lay coiled like bronze serpents across the bench. Keller stood beside a U.S. ordnance sergeant who grinned as he fed the first belt. 500 rounds, the sergeant said. No cooling breaks. Let's see what your German steel thinks of that. The M2 thundered to life. Its rhythm was slower than the MG-42's frantic rattle, more deliberate, more certain, like a heartbeat that never lost its timing. After 200 rounds, the barrel glowed orange. At 400, nearly white. The sergeant yelled over the noise, "Still firing!" And it did, until the final shell casing danced from the ejection port. Silence followed, except for the ticking sound of hot metal shrinking. Keller approached, eyes fixed on the smoking barrel. The smell of carbon filled his lungs. He touched the side gently and felt the heat pulse through his glove. "Unglaublich," he whispered. "We build clocks, they build hammers." Vogt nodded grimly. "And hammers win wars." The test data was astonishing. The M2 had fired all 500 rounds without a single stoppage. Not a jam, not a broken spring. In contrast, the German MG-42's sustained fire limit was 250 rounds before mandatory barrel change. Precision had a price. It demanded rest. The Browning didn't. It was the difference between a surgeon's scalpel and a blacksmith's mallet, and in total war, the mallet survived. That night, Keller stared at his notes. Under the flickering bulb, he wrote, "We engineered perfection until it broke under its own pride. They engineered compromise and found eternity." The next morning, a camp mechanic showed him an American Jeep engine. "Same logic," the man said. "Parts from 10 factories, all fit. You break it, you fix it. Keep going." Keller smiled sadly. "Our machines break men. Yours make them stronger." Later, at the camp fence, he overheard two guards arguing about the future. One said, "When this war's over, these guns will build highways, tractors, airplanes." The other laughed. "Hell, I bet they'll still be using this 50 cal in the next war too." He was right. The M2 would serve in Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf, even Afghanistan, unchanged in its design. Keller could not have known that, but he sensed it. He saw in that glowing barrel a symbol larger than warfare, a culture that prized endurance over elegance. Germany had built weapons to impress generals. America built them to be inherited. A rumor spread in the camp that one of the M2s tested that day had survived over 100,000 rounds across its lifetime. Keller doubted it, until an American guard swore he had seen it himself at Fort Benning. "The gun won't die," the man said. "You just feed it, and it forgives you." That phrase haunted Keller. Forgiveness. In metal. Perhaps that was the ultimate difference. Their weapons punished the imperfect. This one tolerated human error and kept fighting. When dusk came, he walked back alone, the prairie wind brushing through the barbed wire. In the distance, the sky flared red with sunset, the same color as the gun barrel had been hours earlier. It was as if the horizon itself refused to cool. In June 1944, Camp Gruber received visitors, American officers from the War Production Board, accompanied by a handful of journalists. They wanted to interview the German engineers about their impressions of American industry. Keller stood in a clean uniform, his cap tucked under his arm, watching the convoy of olive green trucks unload crates stamped Colt, Frigidaire, and Savage Arms. These were not just guns. They were the geography of industry made visible. The visitors showed a short film inside the camp theater, flickering black and white reels of the Rock Island Arsenal, the Frigidaire division in Dayton, and the Saginaw steering plant in Michigan. Keller leaned forward, mesmerized. He saw women in coveralls, teenagers, even old men assembling machine guns under fluorescent light. No gilded laboratories, no slogans about destiny, only speed, rhythm, repetition. The narrator in the film proudly declared, "This week, 12 factories produced over 3,000 Browning M2 heavy machine guns. All interchangeable, all reliable. 3,000 in a week." Keller's pencil froze. Back home, Mauser's annual output of the MG-42 rarely reached half that number, and those guns required hand-fitted bolts and tolerances checked by specialists with monocles. The Americans, in contrast, had built a weapon that invited mass production. It didn't need devotion. It needed workers who believed their work mattered. Later that afternoon, Keller was escorted to a small workshop where American mechanics let him inspect several guns fresh from the crate. Every part from 10 different factories slid together perfectly. The sergeant said proudly, "We can swap a bolt from Connecticut with one from California. She'll fire just fine." Vogt exhaled, astonished. "They don't build weapons," he whispered. "They build a language." That night, Keller wrote in his diary, "Standardization, their truest religion. Each identical screw a prayer that the next man will do his part." In the barracks, arguments broke out among prisoners. Some still clung to their old arrogance. "Mass production is soulless," one muttered. Others, mostly younger men, disagreed. "Soul," one said quietly, "is when the machine serves everyone." Keller remembered the slogan painted over his former Stuttgart workshop, "Precision is purity." He now realized purity had made them fragile. In America, impurity, the collaboration of rough hands and rough ideas, had forged invincibility. He began sketching not a gun, but a factory layout. Wide aisles, standardized stations, conveyor lines. In the margin, he wrote, "This is the true weapon." At evening roll call, an American guard asked if they missed home. Keller answered truthfully, "Sometimes, but lately I think we are living inside the future." The guard didn't understand, but smiled anyway. As the weeks passed, Keller's notes thickened with figures. 12 factories, 3,000 M2s per week, over 2.5 million guns and spares produced by 1945. Each weapon tested to fire 600 rounds per minute with less than 0.5% malfunction rate. A weapon life expectancy of 100,000 rounds before overhaul. To Keller, these were not statistics. They were verses of an industrial scripture. He realized that the M2 was not merely a weapon of war, it was a promise. A promise that trust, repetition, and cooperation could defeat fear and hierarchy. He turned to Vogt before lights out. "When we go home," he said softly, "we must teach our children that genius is not what one man invents, but what a million hands can repeat." What about you, watching this right now? Do you think the age of craftsmanship has truly died, or has it simply changed its name to teamwork? Leave your thoughts below. I'd like to hear what you believe survives after perfection ends. Outside, the floodlights hummed, throwing shadows of gears and hands onto the barracks wall. A mural of men and machines forging a single heartbeat. Autumn 1944. The war was turning. American newspapers reached the camp faster than hope reached Europe. Keller read about Allied troops pushing through France, the liberation of Paris, and the breakout from Normandy. But what caught his eye wasn't the battle reports. It was a small column on page 4, John Moses Browning, the man behind the gun that saved the free world. Browning, the name that haunted every test, every field report, every recoil. Keller borrowed the paper from a guard and read the full story. Browning had died in Liège in 1926, at his workbench, mid-design. He never lived to see the M2 enter production, never saw it roar across North Africa or thunder in Europe. Keller's hands trembled slightly as he whispered to Vogt, "He died before his war began." That evening, under a dim bulb, Keller read the translated biography aloud. Browning had been a gunsmith's son from Utah, building his first working rifle at 13. He never patented to boast. He patented to improve. His workshop was small, his handwriting uneven, but his ideas precise. One American guard added quietly, "They say he could look at a jammed gun and fix it before it cooled." Keller closed the book, staring at the floorboards. "He designed for a century he'd never see," he said. "That's why his work belongs to all of them." Vogt nodded. "A German engineer designs for perfection. He designed for permanence." They spent days afterwards sketching from memory the entire recoil cycle of the M2. The more they studied it, the more they understood Browning's philosophy. Parts that could forgive dust, hands that could misalign, yet still find balance. It was a gun designed for men under stress, not for men under supervision. In the mess hall, one American corporal overheard their quiet admiration. "Funny thing," he said, "that old man never finished school. He just worked till he dropped." Keller looked at him. "Then he reached immortality by mistake." Weeks later, the prisoners were allowed to help repair damaged training weapons. When Keller opened one gun, he found a faint stamp inside the receiver. Designed by J.M. Browning. It was like finding a signature inside the heart of a living thing. That night, rain lashed the barracks roof. Keller couldn't sleep. He imagined Browning's last day, a simple desk in Belgium, the ticking of a clock, his final sketch half finished. He thought of German inventors he had admired, men who died waiting for recognition, whose ideas drowned under bureaucracy and pride. Browning's humility had become his immortality. He wrote one final note in his notebook that night. "The truest engineer is one who works for people who will never know his name." When morning came, news spread that another German city, Aachen, had fallen. Keller folded his drawings and placed them under his pillow. For the first time, defeat didn't feel like punishment. It felt like revelation. As the camp loudspeaker played Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy, the rhythm mingled with the clatter of workshops, the hum of engines, and the distant thunder of a war shifting west. Keller whispered to himself, he died before victory, but his work outlived every flag. He turned to the guard, cleaning his rifle nearby, and asked quietly, "Do your people ever forget the men who built your future?" The guard shrugged. "Sometimes, but their work keeps reminding us. And you, listening to this, do you think history remembers its builders or only its destroyers? Tell me below, because one day, the answer might decide what kind of world we keep building." Outside, the rain slowed. The workshop lanterns flickered against puddles of oil, each reflection carrying the same glow. The quiet legacy of a man who never saw his own victory, yet built everyone else's. Spring 1945. Germany was collapsing, and the Oklahoma sky blazed with storms. Rumors passed through Camp Gruber that the war in Europe was ending. Some prisoners cheered quietly, others stared blankly, their pride dissolving faster than the snow. Keller walked to the perimeter fence at dawn, where sparrows perched on the wire that once caged him. A truck radio blared across the yard. Berlin surrounded, Hitler silent, the Reich in ruins. The same day, an American officer arrived to oversee the final inspections of weapons before shipment to Europe. Among the crates stood a Jeep-mounted M2 Browning darkened with oil, its serial plate dated 1942. Keller asked to see it up close. The officer agreed. "This one," he said, "came from Normandy. She's seen everything. The beaches, the hedgerows, the bridges." Keller ran his hand along the cold steel, feeling dense like scars. "Still works?" he asked. "Better than ever," the officer smiled. That evening, a film reel flickered in the camp hall, footage of Allied columns rolling toward Berlin. Keller watched as the camera panned to a convoy, jeeps, tanks, trucks. On one jeep, a gunner grinned beneath his helmet, his hands gripping the M2. It was the same model Keller had studied 2 years earlier in the desert. The caption read, "April 1945, U.S. forces enter Germany." He leaned forward. The gun that mocked him in Tunisia now thundered toward his homeland. A weapon built by workers who shared coffee instead of metals was now breaking through the capital of the most disciplined army on earth. Keller didn't blink. He only whispered, "The man who built this is dead, but his idea still fights." Vogt sat beside him, trembling. "So our genius dies, and his simplicity conquers." Keller nodded. "Perhaps that's justice." When the film ended, silence filled the room. The projector clicked, repeating its last frame. The image of a Browning blazing above a jeep, brass shells flying like sparks of destiny. Keller walked out into the night. The air smelled of dust and rain. He looked at his hands, the same hands that once drew the blueprints of over-engineered failure. He thought of the factories, the laughter, the smell of American oil and freedom. He thought of Browning's death in 1926, and how the gun had outlived not only him, but every ideology that tried to control the human spirit. Weeks later, the war ended. The camp gates opened. Keller was processed for repatriation and handed back his diary. On the last page, he wrote a single line: "The trigger that outlasted ideology is the one pulled by every man who believes in simple things." As he boarded the train home, he glanced at the guards who had once been his captors. They were shaking hands with prisoners, sharing cigarettes, exchanging addresses. Somewhere in the background, the familiar metallic clank of a gun being cleaned echoed, not as threat, but as ritual. When the train began to move, Keller looked out the window. The horizon shimmered with heat and light, the same color as the Browning's barrel the day it first burned in his hands. He didn't see defeat, he saw continuity. The M2 was still there in every hand that refused to quit, in every mechanic who built without glory, in every soldier who trusted a simple design to protect something greater than pride. As the fields rolled by, Keller closed his eyes and imagined one last image. A jeep driving through Berlin's rubble, the Browning still mounted, still alive, its operator too young to know who designed it. In that endless noise of metal and resolve, Keller finally understood. Simplicity doesn't die because it doesn't need permission to live. And so the story of a machine became the story of men. Those who built it, those who fought it, and those who finally learned from it. The screen fades to black. One sound remains. The steady clicking of a Browning bolt resetting itself, ready again for another century. When the war ended, thousands of German engineers returned to shattered cities and empty workshops. Some rebuilt factories, others rebuilt themselves. But among them were a few who carried something intangible, not blueprints, but lessons. The M2 Browning had taught them that durability was not the opposite of intelligence, and that greatness could exist without glory. In Stuttgart, Keller would later teach apprentices not to chase perfection, but to serve purpose. He dismantled old weapons and redesigned them into farm machinery. A good tool, he told them, is one that forgives its user. And though his students never knew his past, they inherited the quiet philosophy of a man who once bowed before an American gun and saw humility instead of humiliation. The M2 itself outlived empires. From Korea's frozen hills to the deserts of Kuwait, from Vietnam's jungles to Afghanistan's valleys, the same design kept returning. Not as a relic, but as a reminder that endurance is the truest form of genius. Every echo of its firing still carries a fragment of that revelation. That simplicity, built on trust and shared purpose, can outlast every ideology, every flag, every century. History remembers the wars of nations, but it's the machines of ordinary men that truly shape what survives. Perhaps that's why the M2, the gun that mocked genius, still roars, not out of defiance, but out of continuity. So when we speak of invention, of design, or of progress, maybe we should remember the lesson Keller learned in the desert, that the most powerful idea humanity ever built was not complexity, it was cooperation.